There are moments in politics when a government defense of its actions reveals more than the actions themselves ever could. This is one of those moments. Right now, as you watch this, Labour ministers are standing before cameras attempting to justify why they paid £500 to a migrant sex offender to persuade him to leave Britain voluntarily rather than fight his deportation. Read that sentence again and let the sheer absurdity of it sink in. A man who entered this country illegally, who was housed in taxpayer-funded accommodation, who then sexually assaulted a child, who was convicted and imprisoned for his crime, was then offered cash by the British government as an inducement to board a deportation flight without causing trouble. And when the inevitable outcry erupted, when MPs and the public expressed understandable fury at this grotesque state of affairs, Labour's response was not contrition or acknowledgement of failure. It was justification. It was explanation. It was a policing minister, Sarah Jones, going on national television to explain why paying off a paedophile was actually the sensible, cost-effective decision that any reasonable person should understand and accept. Welcome to UK Decoded, where we expose the truth behind the political narratives that shape our nation. Subscribe now for daily analysis of the stories that reveal exactly who this government serves, and it is certainly not you. The facts of this case are as straightforward as they are damning. Haidish Kebetu, a migrant who entered Britain illegally, was placed in taxpayer-funded accommodation while his status was processed through our overwhelmed asylum system, rather than being immediately detained and removed, as any sane immigration policy would require. He was released into British society. He then proceeded to sexually assault a child, was arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and imprisoned at Wormwood Scrubs. Finally, after all of that, after he had already inflicted irreversible harm on a British child and cost taxpayers enormous sums in accommodation, investigation, prosecution, imprisonment, and eventual deportation, the government decided the sensible thing to do was offer him £500 to leave quietly. The justification offered by Policing Minister Sarah Jones reveals a mentality that has become endemic in Labour's approach to immigration and border security. Speaking on Sky News, she explained that removing Kebetu from the flight on Tuesday and taking him back into custody would have cost thousands of pounds, so the £500 offer represented the economical choice. And that was a choice, galling though that is, she said, adding, "I hope people understand that that was a choice they face, and that was the right thing to do." Let us examine that statement carefully, because it encapsulates everything wrong with how this government approaches immigration, crime, and its fundamental duties to British citizens. First, the framing of the choice itself. Jones presents this as a binary decision between paying £500 or spending thousands. But that framing deliberately obscures the actual choices available and the decisions that led to this impossible situation. The real choice was made long before Kebetu stood at Heathrow Airport threatening to claim asylum and exploit human rights laws. The real choice was made when he was allowed into accommodation rather than being detained. The real choice was made when he was released into communities rather than being immediately removed. The real choice was made when the government prioritized the supposed rights of illegal migrants over the safety of British children. Every one of those choices led inexorably to the situation where paying off a convicted sex offender seemed like the path of least resistance. Second, the claim that this was the right thing to do reveals a moral compass so badly broken that it can no longer distinguish between pragmatism and capitulation. The right thing to do would have been preventing Kebetu from entering Britain in the first place. The right thing to do would have been immediately detaining him upon arrival rather than providing accommodation. The right thing to do would have been removing him before he had the opportunity to attack a child. The right thing to do, even after all those previous failures, would have been dragging him onto that deportation flight regardless of his threats and protests, making absolutely clear that violent criminals have no capacity to dictate terms to the British government. Instead, Labour chose to pay him. They chose to reward his threats with cash. They chose to establish the precedent that if you are facing deportation, threatening to exploit our human rights laws and asylum system is a profitable strategy. Shadow Home Office Minister Matt Vickers captured the public mood with devastating accuracy when he said no decent government pays off a paedophile. That sentence should not need saying. It should be so obviously true that articulating it feels redundant. Yet here we are, in 2025, with a Labour government that apparently needs to be told that bribing convicted sex offenders is not acceptable policy, regardless of short-term cost considerations. Vickers went further, laying out the full timeline of failure. Labour let a dangerous criminal break into Britain, put him in a taxpayer-funded hotel, allowed him to attack a child, and when he was finally caught, they paid him to leave. Each stage of that sequence represents a separate policy failure, a distinct moment when different decisions could have prevented the catastrophe that followed. The phrase break into Britain is particularly apt because that is precisely what Kebetu did. He was not invited. He was not screened and approved. He was not assessed and found to be of good character and likely to contribute positively to British society. He broke in, exploiting the chaos of our border system, the inadequacy of our detention capacity, and the perverted interpretation of human rights law that treats foreign criminals as victims whose rights supersede the safety of British citizens. And having broken in, he was rewarded with accommodation, with support, with access to British communities, and ultimately, when his crimes caught up with him, with cash. The detail that Kebetu threatened to claim asylum and exploit human rights laws both before leaving Wormwood Scrubs and again at Heathrow Airport reveals a contempt with which our immigration system is held by those who abuse it. He knew, because everyone knows, that claiming asylum triggers processes that can delay deportation for months or years. He knew that invoking human rights laws brings lawyers and activists swarming to defend the perpetrator while victims are forgotten. He knew that the British government, for all its tough talk, routinely capitulates when faced with legal challenges and potential delays. So he made his threats, calculating correctly that paying him off would seem easier than fighting him. And the tragic thing is, he was right. This is what Britain's immigration system has become under successive governments too weak to reform it and too captured by activist lawyers to enforce it. We have created an environment where the worst people on earth can enter our country illegally, commit the most heinous crimes, and still manipulate the system to their advantage. We have built a structure where deportation, the absolute minimum consequence for foreign criminals, becomes a negotiation rather than a certainty. We have established precedents where threats from those we are attempting to remove are met with concessions rather than overwhelming force. And the people who pay the price are not the politicians making these decisions, not the activists defending criminals, not the lawyers profiting from delays. The people who pay the price are ordinary British citizens, and most horrifically, British children who become victims of criminals who should never have been here in the first place. Sarah Jones's plea that people should understand the choice they face reveals how disconnected Labour ministers are from public sentiment on this issue. No, Minister, the public do not understand. The public do not accept that paying sex offenders is reasonable policy because it saves money in the short term. The public understand that every time you capitulate, every time you pay rather than fight, every time you prioritize administrative convenience over justice and security, you make the problem worse. You create incentive for more criminals to threaten asylum claims. You demonstrate to the world that Britain is weak, that our deportation system can be gamed, that our laws protect perpetrators rather than victims. And you insult the intelligence of British voters by pretending that this represents competent governance rather than comprehensive failure. Every stage of this case happened because Labour do not have the backbone to protect our borders, Vickers said, and that assessment is devastatingly accurate. Backbone is precisely what is required to fix Britain's immigration catastrophe. Backbone to ignore activist lawyers who profit from obstructing deportations. Backbone to ignore human rights legislation that protects criminals at the expense of victims. Backbone to build detention capacity adequate to hold everyone awaiting removal. Backbone to remove people immediately rather than processing asylum claims from those who entered illegally. Backbone to accept the international criticism that will inevitably come from enforcing our borders properly. Labour does not possess that backbone, as demonstrated by their willingness to pay off paedophiles rather than face down their threats. The description of this government as morally bankrupt is strong language, but when you examine their actions and justifications in the Kebetu case, it is difficult to identify a more accurate characterization. A government with functioning moral principles would be horrified at the suggestion of paying convicted sex offenders. A government with functioning moral principles would immediately implement emergency measures to ensure such situations never arise again. A government with functioning moral principles would take full responsibility for the failures that led to this disaster and resign if they could not fix them. Instead, Labour sends ministers onto television to explain why paying off paedophiles is actually sensible policy that taxpayers should understand and accept. That is not governance. That is moral abdication. £500 might seem like a small sum in the context of government budgets that run to hundreds of billions. But those £500 represent something far larger and more damaging than their monetary value suggests. They represent capitulation. They represent weakness. They represent a government so lost in administrative convenience and cost calculations that it has forgotten its fundamental duty to protect citizens and uphold justice. They represent everything that is broken about Britain's approach to immigration, crime, and sovereignty. And they represent exactly why Labour cannot be trusted with border security or public safety, because when faced with difficult choices, they invariably choose a path that requires least courage and delivers most harm. No decent government pays off a paedophile. But then again, as this case demonstrates with appalling clarity, decency has become optional in modern British politics, sacrificed on the altar of administrative convenience and moral cowardice that defines Labour's governance.